right, welcome back to the podcast. I'm here with Ross Dorendorf. He is a local expert for fish and game about mountain goats. Thanks for being on the podcast.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. Appreciate you coming in.
So we were just talking before press record here. You are from Minnesota and got to Ketchikan via Fairbanks.
Yeah.
So of the three places, what's number one? What's your ranking?
Oh, man, it's hard to hit a number
Start
one.
off with a heater right there.
It's hard to get a number one for that, but certainly every place in Alaska has its own unique values and opportunities. And I've loved living in Fairbanks and in Ketchikan, and I've done field work across the state and been lucky enough to do several seasons on the slope in summer and in winter and had a lot of fun up there. So, yeah, I enjoy all of it.
Yeah, some friends in California and down south, they talk about Alaska, and they assume that because you live in Alaska, you go do everything. Like you've driven to Nome or you've driven to hunt caribou, but being in Southeast Alaska, well, A, you can't drive to Nome, and then B, it's tough because there's the travel restrictions in Southeast Alaska. It's prohibitive because you can't drive anywhere, and it's pretty tough to get around. So what's one of the unique things about Fairbanks that you kind of miss because we don't have it here in Ketchikan and you can't just go drive and do it?
I would have to say the cold. I really like cold weather. Growing up in Minnesota, always enjoyed going north and going for skis, snowshoes, and stuff like that. But, here I can still get at the snow if I climb up the mountain, so it's pretty good too.
Yeah, that's kind of the tough thing, not having a ski resort. I've been in Juneau a couple of times. They get a lot more snow, but up here it's, unless you're taking a snow machine up or skinning up, it's kind of hard to get in the snow. Do you do any of that stuff or snowshoe or what?
Pretty much snowshoe. Yeah, I'll hit the ridge and just kind of take off, and having a lot of fun doing that with friends. So
yeah, if you like cold weather sports, then it's pretty nice. You can go through the winter pretty good.
Mm-hmm. Yep, definitely.
So what about hunting? You do much hunting?
Yeah. Yep. I grew up in Minnesota hunting, the classic white-tailed deer and small game and things like that. No one in my immediate family actually hunted. So I learned from my friends' fathers, and they kind of brought me out, taught me how to hunt, taught me how to trap, and I learned so much, and that really pushed me towards going to the profession that I'm in now, and I absolutely love it.
What was the education like? Or what was your major and all that? Yep.
So after high school, went to Stevens Point, Wisconsin, which is right in the dead center of Wisconsin. If you've never been, probably most people haven't, but it's actually an excellent natural resource school. So learned there and got a wildlife degree there for my 4-year. And then the trend for education requirements to get into some of these jobs has through the years kind of been pushed up and up just because they're so popular. So the natural next step was to do a master's degree. And I did that up in Fairbanks at the University of Alaska Fairbanks there. So I graduated and I did a project with trappers in interior and northeastern Alaska. Learned a lot from them, had a great time working with them, and we got some interesting information on how different trappers are, how they trap based on their motivation to trap. So, we kind of came out with 4 major groups, which one was the motivation to trap to control predators and more management oriented. The biggest group was recreation. So people that just like to get out and trap, just to be outside. A lot of folks like to get outside just to, be active in the winter.
Yeah,
it's dark and cold in Fairbanks in the winter, so it's a big drive. So, had a great time doing that and working with those folks.
Were you attracted to Fairbanks to do that, or was that where an opportunity was and so you took it?
Both. I actually was doing a field project in Kodiak, working for the refuge there. There was a project on goats and then a project with brown bear that I helped out with. And I was looking for any opportunity in Alaska, and it came up there. And UAF is an excellent resource for that type of a degree, so it worked out really well.
What type of trapping did you focus on? Was it just kind of in general all trapping, or was it specifically like wolves or mink marten? What were you looking at?
So my project was focused on human dimensions. So it was how these different motivations to trap influenced effort for trapping all species. So, a manager can look at that and kind of deduce what the population, it was kind of a snapshot in time showing them how much effort these different folks put in. And through time, the amount of effort putting into trapping is changed by a lot of different things. One of which is things like the price of fur or the price of fuel. But motivation had a big factor to play in that, into how long of a line, how many traps you put out, and things like that. So.
Yeah. Seems like the big motivation for trapping in the Southeast is primarily wolves or at least that's what gets the most attention. People are more apt to post stuff on Facebook about trapping wolves for keeping their predators down. But, have you done anything with that, or just kind of in your job come in contact with it?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's a very popular reason that a lot of folks do trap for wolves in particular. We see that kind of across Alaska as well, that similar mentality of trying to keep predators in check and then kind of share the resource of, for example, here in Southeast, the sick black-tailed deer. So, yeah.
I know I meant to come in here and talk about mountain goats, but I kind of on a tangent with wolves here. Because we have so much more information about different practices and management of predators such as wolves, what has there been the best practice, or how has the wolf trapping and predator control kind of helped or not helped species? There's, I don't know, kind of debates that it does work, doesn't work. What can you enlighten people about some sort of like real truth or something, or what do you got?
Sure. Yeah. There was a good presentation by one of the folks in the department recently at the last Board of Game meeting up in Fairbanks, where a presentation was given specifically on predator control. There's no active predator control in Southeast Alaska, so it's mainly folks that are interested in getting out to trap wolves that are changing their effort depending on usually where they like to deer hunt is a pretty common spot for that. So, yeah, and in terms of management, we just got through a petition to list wolves as a threatened or endangered species. We worked with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, trappers, and other folks that were interested on providing the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service the best information we could. And they came through and found that they, rightfully so, are not threatened or endangered with extinction, which is a win for us. So, yeah.
Yeah, it's kind of unfortunate. The rhetoric and the narrative is that, if people don't step up and save the wolves, they're going to be extinct here like they were in Oregon or Colorado or California. It's just like, this is a totally different habitat. This is way, way different. So it's nice that people are weighing in with actual truthful information to kind of help making a good decision for everybody. But
yeah, and we essentially provided the most recent and best science that we had, and the Fish and Wildlife Service reviewed that and agreed with our standing on it. So.
Nice. All right, on to mountain goats now, promise. Yeah. So I guess we can start there. Mountain goat populations, are they healthy, and what are some of the big factors in the mountain goat populations here in Southeast?
Yeah, I would say across the board they're doing pretty darn well. There's certain locations where goat populations through the years have fluctuated, some down, some up, and it depends on a lot of different things, certainly. Some of the places where goats have been doing really well are where they've been introduced. So areas where goats were not previously, when they're introduced, they do really, really well. And you can imagine a habitat that's been untouched by that specific animal coming into it. And we see things like high birth rates, nannies that give birth at a younger age, give birth to more twins and things like that. We can actually see that change and the difference between here, like Revilla Island, where they were introduced, and the mainland, where they have naturally been for many, many years. And all those things are slightly different between those two. So, yeah.
There are areas around here that it doesn't look like mountain goat territory. When you think of traditional mountain goat territory, you think of just ledges and monolithic faces, where we do have those, but some of the glacial carving has allowed like a nice rounded top that has great vegetation, and it looks great for both deer and goats. Do deer and goats kind of cohabitate? Like, how do they? I've been on mountains where I've seen them both, but do they really care about the other's presence?
That's a good question. And actually, we've got some interesting camera data that we're working on now from the mainland, where we see pictures with deer and goats staring right at each other. And this is up in mountain goat and, summer alpine deer habitat. So they do definitely cohabitate. And really, the limiting factor a lot of times with wildlife is what kind of habitat they're in and how much forage is available. But here in Southeast, we have a really productive system, especially in the summer. So they usually do pretty well, and I think they get along fairly well.
Mm-hmm. What's the main food source, and then how does that transition to winter? And are they migrating down just into the trees? Are they just kind of living off fat? Like, what's their summer versus winter diet?
Mm-hmm. Yep. So in the summer, we get a flush of forbs, so kind of leafy green vegetation that pops out, and that is the mainstay for both in their respective habitats. Obviously, we have deer from the ocean all the way up to the mountain, and they're getting different plant species depending on where they are, whereas mountain goats typically are always near some sort of escape terrain. So they're not necessarily always right on top of the mountain, but they can be down in the woods, as you mentioned, kind of atypical in terms of when you think of goat habitat. But it very much is very productive goat habitat. So, and then migration does occur, certainly. So in the winter, they will come down to where the escape terrain is kind of hidden in the woods, where it's more difficult to see them. And if you talk to a lot of hunters around here hunting at that time of the year, a lot of times you're beach hunting and near steep terrain, or you catch one in the woods if you can. It's almost like deer hunting, so a little different. Yeah.
You mentioned migration as far as maybe sea level up to the top, but what about like maybe heading over to different ridges, different mountain ranges? Like, would they push down off a cluster of mountains into the timber and then go up maybe into a separate cluster, or do they pretty much stay in the same vicinity?
Yeah, that's a good question. Goats are very much homebodies. So what we see is after a goat is born, they'll stay with their nanny group until, male or female, until it's about 2 or 3 years old. And right when they hit that age range, they will potentially start to try moving to other areas and see what they're like. Males specifically will go out with other male groups, and then females are the least likely to disperse, but they'll kind of test out and see if they move. But once they've established on a ridge, they really stay pretty much on that ridge line, and that kind of feeds into our management strategy and why it is the way it is. So
when you're looking at bands, groups, what's a school of mountain goat? What's the group called?
A group.
Group. Okay.
Yep.
How big are those groups, and I'm sure they vary a little bit by mountain range or by area, but what's a good cluster or group?
Yeah, it just depends on how big the system is. So if you have a small ridge line, you're going to have less goats. If you have a big one, you might have more. But some of the counts, for example, that we get in a single group here on Revilla, again, an introduced population doing very well, might be upwards of 30 goats or so. And I'm sure folks around here have seen it, hiking the ridge lines and looking down, and all of a sudden there's a pile of goats sitting there.
Yeah. For the tag you'll never draw.
Yeah, that's a tough one.
Yeah. And then if there is like a nanny shot, that can be more of an exponential issue, because I know that it's a billy tag, but if you shoot a nanny, it doesn't necessarily count against you unless it has kids with it. Is that still the regulation there?
A little different. So depending on what area that you're talking about in Unit 1A, the only billy-only hunt is actually on the Cleveland Peninsula, and that's the only billy-only hunt in the entire state. Mm-hmm. But otherwise, you can get a male or female, but that goes for the draws that are right above town here, DG006 and 005. And then aside from that, and the rest of Unit 1A, it's registration permit, and that gives you the ability to shoot either or. And recently, we got a 2-goat bag limit, and with that, if you shoot a billy, you come down off the mountain and you check it in with us. We take some measurements and information, and if you'd like you can get a second permit. That's only if you shoot a billy on the first one. And then you can't shoot the second goat in the same hunt zone which you shot the first one. And there's also now a requirement across Southeast Alaska, if you do want to hunt here, to take the online goat quiz and pass that. And we do really push and encourage folks to harvest billies because it's less effect on the population. When you remove females, you're taking away the producers for the population. So, and that's especially true with goats that have a very low reproductive rate compared to other animals like deer.
So let's pretend that there's a cluster of mountains. So I go up there and I shoot a billy. My wife shoots a billy, and someone else goes up there and shoots a nanny. Thinks it's a billy, but shoots a nanny. Doesn't have kids with it. Someone else shoots a nanny. What might be a numbers game, or I mean, is that spot going to be really, really hammered? And how long might it take to kind of recoup? Again, size matters for sure, as far as like how big the cluster of mountains is, and also the goats. But what's the difference in long-term survival of that group or size of that band if you start taking out nannies?
Yeah, that's a good question. So that leads into our management strategy for here in Unit 1A, and Baranoff also has a similar strategy, and I've just got a map here that you can kind of look at. But on that, you can see that all of Revilla and the mainland in Unit 1A is sectioned off into what we call hunt zones. And within these hunt zones, we survey. We can't survey every single hunt zone every year, but we try to concentrate our efforts on the areas that are most commonly harvested from. So we try to get those as often as we can, and then the areas that are less harvested, we do those less frequently in terms of getting a minimum count. With that minimum count, we get obviously the minimum number of goats that are there, and we never can count all of them. So we've our folks up in Juneau have created a model that we can take that data and the survey conditions from that area and that time and run it through a model to estimate the number that we didn't see. And then we incorporate that into the overall population estimate for that area. And with that, we can harvest a certain percentage of that. And that percentage differs whether you're in an area where their goats are introduced, like on Revilla, or on the mainland where they're native. And the native population, you have to be more careful management-wise because you can overharvest more easily because of their lower reproductive rate for the females. And age to first reproduction is a higher age, and these different things come into play. So it just depends. To answer your question, it depends on the hunt zone and what the current population is there. And on the Revilla, if we have a large count in a single area, we allow harvest up to 7% of the population estimate, whereas on the mainland, we allow up to a maximum of about 4%. So you have to be fairly careful with not over-harvesting, because if you were to allow wide open harvest, folks get out and harvest a bunch of nannies, that can have long-term effects on the population. And we may be seeing some of that in several locations in the mainland here on Revilla, where in the past, and this is from 1980 till now, some of the counts have been much higher than they are, somewhere in the tune of 150 to 200 goats in a single hunt zone. Now they're more like in the 50 to 100 zone. So they're long-term, and they can stay that way for a very long time. And research across North America has shown that even when hunting is completely eliminated, it can still take a very long time for a population to come back. So that's what we want to avoid, is that decrease to the point where we have to shut down areas preemptively.
The amount of registration tags is not unlimited, but is there ever a year in which the registration tags, and that's the over-the-counter registration for residents, non-residents have to have a guide. Are there times when the amount of tags is restricted or limited?
No, registration permit, so there's no limit. So as many people that would like one could get one. The thing that we do is we monitor harvest in season. So when someone harvests a goat, they bring it in. I say we seal. We don't actually put any locking tag or anything or sealing tag on it, but we take measurements. We're aware that that animal was harvested, and that's why we have the requirement when you take an animal to report it within about 5 days so we know. And once we hit the quota, that 4 or 7%, depending on where you are, could be a little bit lower than that if it's a smaller population, we'll close those certain hunt zones down by emergency order. And the advantage, too, of having these smaller areas is that we can shut down a small area, but then the rest of the zone, or the rest of the Unit 1A can stay open. So we can close down those small areas where the rest of the greater area is still open.
So if someone goes out to Texas Creek, which is right on the border of Canada, and then you said the 4% was what your...
A maximum of 4, but it scales. So if we have a smaller population, our minimum that we want to harvest from is 50. So if it's less than that, typically we won't allow harvest unless it's a zone that basically gets zero harvest and all of a sudden someone comes out. But essentially it's 50 to 100, you get a certain percentage, 2%, and then 100 to 150, it's 3%, and then above that, it's 4%. So we kind of scale it as well.
And then based on that harvest, the next year's numbers will be in relation to that?
Yep, and that's one way we can maintain that level of harvest each year is by doing those emergency orders when we need to. So,
mountain goats are notoriously rugged and tough. How much impact does a big snow year have on them?
Yeah, it definitely can have a significant effect on the overall population. I want to say it was 1970, 1971 where we had significant snow years across Alaska, and it really influenced populations of multiple critters across the land. And one of those was mountain goats, where we saw probably a 50% reduction in the population within those couple years of really hard winters. So essentially, if they can't access the forage, they can't survive the winter. When winter comes around, they're on a negative caloric deficit that whole time. They're maintaining themselves with what forage they can find, and one thing they go down and eat are things like lichens or vaccinium, like blueberries, and they'll sustain themselves. But once spring kicks in, you'll see that they're pretty skinny, and you can really see that with deer as well. They're not as shaggy, and you can see they're kind of down, running on their last fumes.
Yeah, I tend to hear when people are concerned about snow, it's more for deer than it is for mountain goats. So I didn't know if they're better equipped to be able to survive through heavy snow, which seems like they would be, but like no animal would be completely, immune to the impacts of a big snow year. And what about predation? Again, most we think about wolves and deer. Do wolves track down the mountain goats, or they kind of just stick with the deer?
They do. Yep. Yeah, we're helping our researchers based out of Juneau with some predation rates work right now, and they are looking at predation rates of wolves on the different animals that they typically go after. And we go out and we collar a wolf, and then that wolf runs around, and for 2 specific months out of the year, we get fixes on the GPS location of that animal very frequently. So every 30 minutes we get a point. And what happens is they're making their way around the landscape, and then all of a sudden there's a big cluster of these locations in one area, and we hone in on that as a potential kill site. So we go in and we investigate and see what species it was, what sex it was, age class, and things like that, and collect a whole bunch of information. And that study is ongoing right now. And one thing that we have seen is they certainly eat deer and goats. And then Gretchen Roffler, our predator prey biologist out of Juneau that's doing this work, also recently published a good paper on wolf diet specifically. And you can kind of see the different proportions throughout Southeast Alaska. And that was great to see, not only how what portion of, say, deer or goat is in their diet, but the variety. There's a wide variety of species that they go after in some areas where they even mainly subsist off of ocean resources, so things like marine mammals and things like that. But wolves are not the only predator. So we also have black bears. And black bears will often go after the kids during the kidding season, which is in May. So a lot of times, if you're up in the Alpine, I've seen this a couple times here, specifically on Revilla, you can see a black bear just idling by a group of nannies and kids, just kind of waiting to get that opportunity to go in and grab one. And I specifically recall within our predation rates work for wolves that I did find a bear that had killed a 1.5-year-old nanny and had it cached under a big rock. So they definitely can be an important predator of the mountain goats. One interesting thing, though, is that, we certainly have brown bears here as well. They can predate on goats, but it's seemingly they're not as an important of a predator as black bear and wolves. And a good example of that is Baranof Island and Kodiak Island, where the goats were introduced. They're doing very well, although we get some very high brown bear we have very high brown bear populations on these two islands, yet these goats perpetuate and are doing really well. So it doesn't seem like, on the surface anyways, that they're a very important predator.
Southeast here, especially the mainland, obviously the mainland, the brown bears seem like it would be very difficult for them to access some of that alpine area because you just got misty fjords for most of it. So I don't know how they would even get up there. But the population in Kodiak seems like it's doing extremely well. Were the goats introduced at similar times, and what is it about that habitat that has allowed them to really proliferate?
So goats in Kodiak were introduced in 1952. There's a small group that was released there, and this really interesting effect happens when they're introduced in a single area like they were in Kodiak, where you kind of get this ripple effect in the population. So there's an initial spike in the population of goats right where they were introduced to. And then from there, the population goes up around that area. So it's kind of like, think of dropping a stone into a pond, and that the middle eventually starts to go down a little bit, but the outside of that, it just keeps going up the further away you get from that area. Here on Revilla, we had two introductions on Revilla. One was in 1983, and that was up near the Reed Mountain area. And then the other one was right in the Mahoney Basin area. And as you can see, in those two areas, those are kind of our highest concentrations of goats at this time. And in both areas, they're doing very well. Since then, they have populated all of Revilla, and they are throughout the island. But it seems that those two areas in particular are still kind of the high points.
So everything from the rest of Revilla was populated from Reed and Mahoney. So the ones over on Dude and Deer and all those areas that came from that original one. Huh,
yep.
Interesting.
Yeah, so they've really spread out. So some of the goats were taken from the Cleveland Peninsula and then also over in the Misty Fjords area. So that's kind of the combination of critters that we have. So,
and pretty good genetics, I hear.
Yeah. There's something in the water. The goats from Southeast Alaska and also in just across the border in British Columbia in this area produce some incredible animals. Multiple world records come from this general area right in Revilla, and then also just across the border in BC. So a couple years ago, the Board of Game opened up a hunt on the Cleveland Peninsula, which hadn't been hunted for quite a while due to population concerns. But a gentleman went out and harvested the world record Pope and Young mountain goat there. So, yeah, like I said, there's definitely something in the water here.
Yeah. How does the mountain goat population and maybe genetics vary from here and then the northern part up 1C? In the Haines and Skagway area, because it's still Southeast Alaska, but you're talking hundreds of miles.
Yeah, the difference genetically is pretty amazing with mountain goats, because like I mentioned before, they're kind of homebodies. So a lot of times they'll stay on one mountain ridge for their whole life, and generations of goats will kind of stay there, so there's not a ton of intermixing. There certainly is some, and they do make movements. However, some of the results that I can think of off the top of my head have shown that populations in Southeast Alaska that are within even just a couple, 50 or so miles of each other can be very different and unique from one another. Mm-hmm. So,
what about as far as Southeast Alaska harvest goes? Where's kind of the area that gets the most harvest? It seems like southern and Southeast Alaska in this 1A area. It seems like that's what gets hammered the most with hunters. Do people up north enjoy the mountain goat hunts as much, or is it just because the population is more dense down here?
I think they certainly do. Yeah. There's quite a few avid goat hunters here for sure. But that's kind of sprinkled throughout Southeast Alaska. Baranof gets quite a few because of the population is doing pretty well. It's, again, introduced, so there's a lot of animals there. People doing combo hunts and things like that. So, there's a good mix, but this area in particular gets a fair amount, and most of it is locals. There's a lot of locals that come out. We get a couple non-residents for sure. But it's a good bit of local folks getting out.
Mm-hmm. What's your favorite thing to hunt?
That's a hard question. Here in particular, I've really enjoyed hunting Sitka black-tailed deer. There's something magical about when you get one to come into the call and it all works out, which is not always.
Yeah, right.
But it's certainly a lot of fun. And then I would say maybe my favorite from spending time up north has to be Dall sheep. Yeah. I really enjoy getting up in the mountains and getting after them and hunting those critters too. So, and I'm overdue for a mountain goat. So I'll need to get on that. I've spent a lot of time in the country and checking them out and working with hunters, which I've really enjoyed, and fascinated by mountain goats too. So, yeah.
I got a buddy up in Fairbanks. He's done the sheep hunt a couple times, and I do the mountain goat down here. So I want to go up there to sheep hunt with him, and he wants to come down here and mountain goat hunt with me. It's just, what you have. It's not that you get tired of it, but you know that there's something else out there that you really want to experience. And it's, like I said before, it's kind of tough to figure out where to go because people are pretty tight-lipped, especially with Dall sheep. It seems like that's probably the most coveted mountain. If you hunt that, you are not talking at all about that whatsoever.
Yeah. Yeah, there's definitely some tight-lippedness over that. But folks a lot of times, especially from out of state, that may not know the area, will focus on draw areas and things like that. But there's a lot of really good spots you can walk in for Dall sheep too and get into some good country and just over-the-counter tag sort of thing. It just takes some work to study maps, and the internet's a great resource for looking through and forums and things like that. So
yeah, the scary thing about Dall sheep would just be the counting or the measuring. You get the right angle, and people are rightfully very adamant that you go with someone who knows what they're talking about, because you're up there and you don't, you look at it from the wrong perspective, and then all of a sudden you're shooting a sublegal round. But it seems way more stressful than anything else.
It can be tough. You definitely have to take your time, and the biggest thing is going with your gut and saying, if you're even a little bit unsure, just don't pull the trigger. It's tough to pass up an opportunity, but in the end, it's going to be the best way to go. And we have great resources here in the office for folks that are interested in sheep hunting. I've had a few people come through and talk about how to judge it, and we've got a couple skulls in here that we can look at. And it is just a game of finding the animal first and then really spending time getting a good look at it. And it is amazing, though. Once you see one that is legal, it's kind of a duh factor. You wade through a bunch of sublegals, but once you see one that is legal, it's like, oh, yeah, there it is.
Yeah, that's what I would hope it would be like that. It would just be an obvious one. When my wife and I were up at Denali, and obviously those are park rams, but it was just cool to see in person, a couple definite legal ones. Think, okay, that would be awesome if we were somewhere else, had a tag and all that stuff. But just watching them, it's just a different experience, and seeing them and being able to just put eyes on a real one rather than just looking up pictures and whatnot. So that's pretty cool. Well, what's more maybe spooky or less tolerant of human movement? Would that be a goat or a sheep in your experience?
Well, in my experience, sheep hunting, I can start there. I would say that there are certain age classes and sexes that are more tolerant of movement. So one great experience that I had with a friend, we were out hunting and we were coming up over the precipice of a mountain looking down. It was a little bit foggy and we looked down and we saw a big group. And instantly we think, well, using lambs, we shouldn't spend too much time. But my friend said, hey, there's a ram down there. I said, okay. So we looked at it and sure enough, it looked really good. So we were trying to figure out how to get to it because the fog had cleared. This whole hillside was wide open, not a lot of terrain features to hide behind. And all we had were little crevices that kind of went down the mountain, not deep, maybe a foot or two. And we had to go through the ewes and lambs. So we're like, well, it's worth at least trying, you know? So we got down to a spot where we popped up and we're like, well, we're going to get seen. We got to be careful. Dropped our packs and we belly crawled probably 400-500 yards down through this little trench. And inevitably, ewes and lambs saw us. They just kind of stared at us. So they're fairly forgiving. We had one maybe 3 or 4 year old ram that spooked a little bit, but none of the others did. So we were eventually able to get within 100 yards of this ram, judge it, and it was legal. And my friend took it and ended up being a nice 11-year-old that was hidden in with ewes and lambs. With goats, you know, it just depends. My experience is just hiking around. It seems like you get the older, more experienced animals, and they might be out of there a little bit quicker, and how close you are and things like that. But they can be fairly forgiving as well, depending on the situation.
Yeah, it seems like the ones that are on the traverse are ones that are kind of used to people. They're kind of off the edges a little bit. But we were on, I think it was Roy Jones. We're camping in the middle of the night. We kind of heard something kind of walking by and woke up in the morning, and they were 50 yards away, just kind of hanging out. But maybe a little bit, I wouldn't say habituated, but at least, somewhat used to people versus if you go somewhere else, they might be a little bit more maybe spooky or even more curious because they're just, what is that thing? So it's always interesting to see how they react and cool to be able to get some cool pictures of the animals. Cool to watch them outside of the season.
Yep. Yeah. And I had a similar experience where I was hunting and I was up in sheep country and nothing was around during the evening, and all of a sudden I woke up in the morning and looked around and I was surrounded by sheep, 50 yards away, no problem. But yeah.
That's awesome. Well, anything to add or close on? Anything we didn't get into goat-wise?
We could talk about goats for a long time. I enjoy it. I really enjoy managing here, and my job is great, and I love interacting with hunters and talking to them about their experiences and what they've seen in the field. We're always looking for observations of anything in particular. Sometimes we see goats that have a disease called ORF, or what's called contagious ecthyma, which is a type of herpes that can come through a population. And, any interesting observations like that, people can report to us, and we're happy to get all the information from the folks on the ground.
What is that? How would you notice if there was ORF?
Yeah, you got to look at the lips and nose and the hooves. They'll develop sores, and then sometimes around the eyes. There can be anything from just a couple little sores around the lips or something to goats that some folks a couple years ago took video of that. It was so inflamed around the eyes with all these scabs that it couldn't even see. Ooh. So kind of a sad sight. But it's good to kind of track these things, and our veterinarians are always interested in observations, as are we. Mm-hmm. So
does it affect the meat at all?
You just have to wear gloves. Whenever you're cutting up critters, we always recommend wearing gloves to keep that barrier between your skin and the animal. But if you're good about wearing gloves and cleaning up everything, depending on how you've butchered the animal, of course, and keeping the meat clean, it should be fine to eat.
Cool. Well, anything else?
That's what I can think of. The Board of Game just occurred up in Fairbanks, and the department had an agenda change request in to align the borders of RG002, which is a resident-only 2-goat bag limit hunt, and RG001. There was a little bit of confusion last year. That was the last year that the 2-goat bag limit was implemented. There was one border that was slightly changed during the Southeast Alaska Board of Game meeting, and we have now changed that back. So essentially, the footprint of RG001 is the same as RG002. The problem area was up between the border of Unit 1A and 1B, where a small portion there was the border was put on a ridge line, but now it's no longer that ridge line. It's the Bradfield Canal to the north and up the drainage to Canada. So. We cleaned that up, and I think that that's going to help and be less confusing looking at the regulations in the future. So.
Cool. Well, great. Really appreciate your time, and good talking goats with you.
Yeah. Thanks, Jeff.
Yeah.